for this talk. It is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker. I first came across Andrew when I was at university. I'm afraid I have to say he was far cleverer and more successful than I was, winning a major history prize and becoming president of the Cambridge Union before going on to do a master's at Edinburgh. But Andrew was always quite interesting because whereas everyone around him were becoming lawyers and bankers and politicians and accountants, as was the way in the 80s, Andrew always wanted to be a literary agent. And he followed that path from a very early age, became one of the youngest directors at a major literary agency in London, founded his own agency while he was still in his 20s, in 1988, I think. And, sorry, giving away your age there, Andrew. And has represented a number of very successful, particularly non-fiction authors. His passion has been biography. He founded the Biography Club. He's written biographies himself, John Buchan, Guy Burgess, that some of you may have read. So we're really, very pleased to have Andrew here today to talk about his latest book, The Mountbattens. I did just do a little bit of a Google on Amazon, Andrew, as to go through the series of 5-star reviews for the book. And you'll be pleased to know that it is described as a very impressive combination of historical research, investigative reporting, and good writing. Although, to be honest, I much preferred a quick, easy read, chock full of juicy scandal, would make a great Amazon box set. So with that, Andrew, I'll hand over to you. And just one word of advice, Hurlingham members and their guests will be appalled if you do not cover all the juicy scandal.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, and thank you very much for asking me back. I think I came 3 years ago to talk about Guy Burgess, and this was, I have to say, my largest audience then, and my favourite. I had all sorts of interesting things that came out of it, including a godson of Donald Maclean. I feel rather like the prison minister visiting a prison who said to the people there, "It's so nice to see so many of you here today." When I finished the book on Guy Burgess, who was a sort of dissolute, promiscuous spy, my wife rather nervously said to me, "I hope you're not going to do anyone like that again." And I said, "No, don't worry, I'm doing a very respected member of the royal family." Well, I'm afraid it turned out to be slightly different than I expected. This is what interested me, I think, about this book was to look at not so much a joint biography, but it's I suppose, a portrait of a marriage. One of the reviewers described it as a very English marriage. Since Edwina had 16 lovers that I've counted, I don't know if that's normal for an English marriage or not. I haven't come across many like that. But it does give a completely different perspective. But it's also a book about, I think, two very remarkable people. And it has a very interesting trajectory because the first part of the book, I think our sympathies are with Dickie. His wife is cuckolding him. He's having a pretty tough time trying to build his career. And then the whole thing turns, I think, during the Second World War, where she finds a role for herself. And Dickie perhaps begins to take on some of the more mendacious elements of his character then. What I'm going to do is to... Oh, right, that's interesting. I thought there was going to be a picture over there. I'm going to tell the story through a series of slides. And our story really begins in July 1922 when the two of them get married. This was a huge event. It was described as the wedding of the year in some papers, the wedding of the century in others. The Prince of Wales was the best man. Queen Mary and King George V were among the guests. There was something like 8,000 people who came to see them off. They were actually seen off by towed out of the St Margaret's in Parliament Square by a group of naval cadets. But this was a huge thing. There's a 14-minute Pathé film you can watch on YouTube if you want. There were special souvenirs produced, special editions of papers. And it gives some sense of just what a glamorous couple they were. She at that time was regarded as the richest heiress in the world. Now our story begins with Louie. This is his father, Prince Louie of Battenberg, eventually to become First Sea Lord. His mother, Victoria, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and Louie was the last godchild of Queen Victoria. Here she is looking down at him. I think she's looking down at him because he just peed on her at that point. And this is Edwina with her grandfather, Ernest Cassell, a very rich banker. He was the banker to Edward VII. She was actually named after Edward VII, and he was her godfather. So a pretty distinguished background. Her ancestors included the Earl of Shaftesbury, the philanthropist, and Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister. This is Dickie as a young boy. A rather sweet character. He was the youngest of 4 children. There was 15 years between him and his older sister, Alice, and 8 years between him and his brother, George. Alice went on to marry the King of Greece and was the mother of Prince Philip. The next child, Louise, married the King of Spain, and George became Marquis of Milford Haven. So it was a pretty, he went around all the great houses of Europe, really, as a young child, very, very close to the Russian royal family. And his first love affair, he said, was with Princess Marie of Russia. Here is Edwina as a young girl. You can see a very attractive girl. Rather sad upbringing. Her mother died when she was 9, and her sister was 5. Brought up by an evil stepmother, was sent away to school, and really found it very difficult to establish any sort of relationship with him. Very emotionally, I would say, restricted, and I think this may explain her behavior slightly later in her adult life. The only love she had at that time was for a menagerie of animals. Dickie went through Dartmouth and only just missed fighting in the First World War at Jutland. After the war, he was sent up on a short officers' course in Cambridge, where he became friendly with Bertie and Henry, the 2 sons of the king, and through them became very close to the Prince of Wales. And when he came down from Cambridge, Prince of Wales asked if he would be his ADC as he went round on a tour of Australia. So there they are on the trip, and he was clearly very much, he kind of inveigled himself into this, but he was very much part of royal circles. Edwina had gone to a school in Eastbourne and then in Aldborough, but she was a slightly sort of rootless character, didn't quite know what to do with her life. She was working as a hostess for as the hostess for her grandfather at this big house, Brook House in Park Lane, and really just didn't know what to do with her life. Dickie was a hopeless romantic. He was always falling in love with people. This was the most, I suppose, fated deb of her day, a woman called Audrey James, illegitimate granddaughter of Edward VII, supposed illegitimate daughter of Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary. She, I'm afraid, spurned Dickie. She married a man called Coates, and the line was that she'd swapped a coat of arms for the arms of Coates. This is Peggy Peyton, another of the rather boot-faced woman, but anyway, he was in love with her, daughter of an Indian colonel. But Dickie was this very flamboyant, very different, imaginative figure, that very different from the sort of men that Edwina was normally meeting. And at Cowes Week in 1921, they were thrown together on a house party. Here is Dickie climbing the mast, as he was wont to do with a friend, Dick Curzon. And they sort of fell in love at that point. They were, he was about to go with the Prince of Wales to India on one of these long 9-month tours. And what happened was Edwina decided that she would follow him. She actually found a chaperone to take her out, Dan Snow's great-grandmother, who was the daughter of Lloyd George. And they got engaged in the Viceroy's house, where else, in Delhi, in February 1922. There was some concern about Dickie. He was seen to be a bit of a gold digger. She would come into a huge fortune, worth tens of millions of pounds, when she married. The Viceroy's wife wrote to Edwina's father and said, I wish she had found someone who had better prospects. He ended up as Viceroy of India, so it wasn't too bad. They got married, as I say, in July 1922. This is them on honeymoon. They had 2 parts of the honeymoon. They drove around visiting his relations in Spain and Germany. This is the Rolls Royce she gave him as a wedding present, quite nice. The great thing about marrying Edwina is it produced, basically, he never had to, I mean, he did work very hard, but he basically never really had to work again. So he gave her position, she gave him wealth. The next part of the honeymoon, they went off to the States. Here they are meeting Babe Ruth. And they crossed on a train across to the west coast, where they stayed at Pickford with Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin had said afterwards he just had a pass from Edwina at this point. So this is a woman making passes at other men on her honeymoon. And this is a picture of Dickie and Charlie Chaplin making a film. And then this is a picture of them coming home. Dickie's not looking quite so happy there. He came back, he continued his naval career, he was often away from home. He made his career as a signals officer, which is a thing a lot of people didn't do, and became a very successful signals officer, both as a lecturer and as a signals officer for the fleet. She really had nothing much to do at home except decorate their houses. They took on the lease of this place called Adstein, just outside Chichester, where she used to have weekend house parties. All sorts of people would come down, like Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, and they would entertain there. And again, one of the things that made them stand out from, I think, other young naval officers is that he would entertain the First Sea Lord without a momentary flicker. They built a 9-hole golf course there. They had he became very interested in polo on his trip to India, and set up a polo pitch. Here he is receiving a polo cup from Queen Mary. Edwina only really finds a purpose in life during the general strike in 1926. Here she is working the switchboard with her best friend Jean Norton, the mistress of Beaverbrook, and I should say also later a mistress of Mountbatten, I think, pretty sure. But finally she in a sense was given something to do, and we begin to see a change in Edwina at this point. They have their first child, Patricia, cutting back slightly, in April 1924. Dickie is a devoted father. He'd always wanted a son, and he made that pretty apparent. But he had this very special bond with Patricia. I'm afraid Edwina was not a very good mother. She'd never really had any sort of example from her own mother, of course, who died, and then having a terrible stepmother. And she basically just abandoned her children to nannies. I mean, there's stories of her going off for 6 or 7 months at a time, missing their birthdays. She, in fact, deposited them at one point in a hotel in Hungary and forgot about them. It's only at the end of only about November, when they were still in their summer kit, they were asked if they could be picked up, and then she couldn't remember where they were. Anyway, she did begin to get a slight purpose in life shortly after this. She began a series of affairs. Since we only have 40 minutes, I won't go through all her lovers. But this is one. This is a guy called Hugh Molyneux, who was the 7th Earl of Sefton, regarded as the best-looking man in society. That lasted for 10 months until he went off to be ADC to the Viceroy in India. The next was a man here called Laddie Sanford, an American polo player and millionaire. I think the rather poignant thing about this picture is at that point Dickie didn't know about the affair. It's thought that Edwina actually had Laddie's child and had to abort it. The next one is Mike Waddle, who worked on the Express, an ex-cavalry officer, very keen huntsman here, who actually in a hunting accident lost an eye and became, of course, even more attractive to women. This is a man called Julian Chaconeau, who is actually quoted in a divorce case that you can find at the National Archives. It's one of the characters we didn't know much about before. And then she switched sex, and this is Sophie Tucker, who was a singer. The man on the left is a rather interesting figure called Peter Murphy, who he'd met at Cambridge. Peter Murphy, in a sense, acted as private secretary throughout his life. He was a sounding board. He was actually a communist, investigated by MI5, and he, in a sense, put the more perverse, the more sort of contradictory view, which then Mountbatten would use to balance his own views, and was a very important figure and carried on with him right through all his posts, combined operations, Southeast Asia, and as Viceroy. And he was there basically to chaperone Edwina, I'm afraid not with much success. Then we have the next one, Bobby Sweeney, an American Rhodes Scholar who was a golfing blue at Oxford and later a Second World War pilot and hero. Then poor old Tony Simpson, a colleague in Malta, who, in fact, his wife brought a case, tried to blackmail the Mountbattens, and basically they had to pay up and Tony, there's this rather anguished correspondence from Tony Simpson saying, I'm very sorry about this. Don't mind sleeping with your wife, but I'm sorry my wife's trying to blackmail yours. This is Larry Gray, an actor who she met on one of her travels. The next thing that she began to do in this sort of restless period in her life was she just traveled all over the world and did the most adventurous things, crossing Siberia, going out to Southeast Asia, going around South America on horse. This is the black phase in her life. This is a man called Paul Robeson, an actor. And this arose suddenly in June 1932. There was a piece in the People saying there's a woman in society who's having an affair with a black man, and Buckingham Palace are very upset. And she realized that she needed to do something about it. So in fact, she brought a case against the People, even though this was actually true. She perjured herself in court to say she'd never met this man. The whole thing was a stitch-up. The case took place at 9:30 in the morning with no press. Basically, a deal was done. There were no damages, but she was able to save her reputation. But from that point onwards, she became very anti-monarchy. She started subscribing to the Daily Herald and became extremely left-wing. This is her long-term lover, a man called Leslie Hutchinson, with whom she enjoyed an affair for about 30 years. And then here is Nada, her sister-in-law, interesting woman, the great-granddaughter of Pushkin. She was married to George, Mountbatten's brother, and the two women would often go traveling together. She was later caught up in a famous lesbian case, the Gloria Vanderbilt case. Gloria Vanderbilt, the child, has only just died. So there were again the continuing concerns about the circles the Mountbattens moved in. Mountbatten had by this stage, of course, discovered his wife's infidelity. He was absolutely shattered by it. And they were due to basically divorce. And it was sort of saved, literally in the middle of the night, when she came back and made an excuse to return a book. They'd always had separate bedrooms. And the marriage was saved. But they agreed that from this point onwards, as long as she was discreet, she could have her affairs, and he would be allowed to have his affairs. And so this is the woman that is his first mistress, a woman called Yola Letellier, married to a very rich French newspaper proprietor, often seen to be the inspiration for the film Gigi. She was supposedly a niece of Colette. And here they are together. The way that Edwina dealt with the affairs, but Dickie was completely without any sort of jealousy and let her get on with it. I'm afraid Edwina would come and peer through the keyholes when he was entertaining anyone. And the poor man, he would come away on leave thinking he was going to go off for a week with Yola, to discover that Edwina had whisked her off somewhere instead. So this is, I think we're coming towards the end. Well, no, we're probably about halfway through the lovers now, I'm afraid. This is Count Anthony Sapari, another of her lovers when she was traveling in Central Europe. And this was one of the great loves of her life, a man called Bunny Phillips. Bunny, because he had a very long back and legs. He was a guards officer, a very interesting man, Spanish speaker, intelligence officer. And she spent a lot of time with him from about 1936 through to his marriage in 1944. He married a woman called Gina Werner. Gina Werner was actually introduced to him by Edwina, and it took her about 2 years to get over this. This is them on holiday. This is them traveling in Africa in 1936. She continued to collect her menagerie of animals. This is Sabi the lion that she brought back to Adstein. And she continued to carry on with her travels. So here she is on the Burma-China Road, the first woman to traverse it in 1939. One of the reasons that she was away was that they were doing up Brooke House, and this is the penthouse flat that they built on the top, still there, designed by Lutyens. The Van Dycks are just on the right there. There was a panel of 60 Rex Whistler pictures in her bedroom. They could entertain 120 on the terrace, and there were huge rooms to show films and things. So they really used this as a very important sort of networking operation. By this stage, Dickie, who'd seesawed between Malta and Portsmouth, was working in the Admiralty. He was actually working with the Fleet Air Arm, or the Air Admiralty bit. And so he was beginning to pick up very good connections in political circles. He was very much against appeasement. He was very close to people like Anthony Eden, even though he was a serving naval officer. This is Broadlands, their home in Hampshire, inherited from her father by Edwina just at the beginning of the war. And I should say something about the royal family. They continue to be very close. If you remember, the Prince of Wales had been his best man. And in fact, Dickie had offered to be the Prince of Wales' best man when he got married. But of course, we had particular problems with the abdication. This is Wallace and the Mountbattens on holiday with the king in Prince of Wales in 1935 in Cannes. But they were very much part of the whole discussions going on during 1936. And Dickie was with the three brothers when David decided to abdicate in December 1936. On the outbreak of war, Dickie was given command of a destroyer, the HMS Kelly, he's often associated with. Here he is on Kelly, bringing the Duke of Windsor back from France. I'm afraid Dickie was a terrible sea captain. Kelly actually only managed to be at sea for about 40 days in the first 18 months of the war. Most of that time it was in dock, having suffered some calamity at the hands of its captain. So he had a propensity for going over mines. He would go too quickly, so, for example, a couple of seamen would be whisked off the side. He would give away his presence by signalling in the wrong way. He didn't turn up where he was meant to at the right time, as a result that people ended up in prisoner of war camp for 4 years. He managed to get torpedoed. Here's an example. But this was the making of him, because he actually came back from having been torpedoed. He came literally on his own with a very skeleton crew, and this so captured the imagination of Winston Churchill that he made two decisions. One, that Dickie should never, ever be allowed to be on board in command of a ship again, and the other is that he should become head of combined operations. They thought his energy and his imagination would be very useful here, and that proved to be true. Combined operations had a role to mount amphibious raids against occupied Europe, but also to prepare for D-Day. The other good thing that came out of Kelly was that Noel Coward, who's a friend, had been told he should make a propaganda film, and he could see the story of Kelly, which eventually was sunk at the Battle of Crete, would make a wonderful propaganda drama. And so it's basically the story of Mountbatten, even down to the speeches that Mountbatten gave, real speeches he gave. So here are the King and Queen with Princess Elizabeth at Denham in April 1942, watching the filming. Now, Edwina's career had begun to take off at this point. She had joined the St. John Ambulance at the beginning of the war. She quickly rose through the ranks to take the top female position. She spent the Blitz driving around to shelters and making sure people were okay. She basically got the whole organization going, using her contacts, her energy. Very, very efficient and effective operator. And here she is in 1943 receiving a CBE for her work. So finally she could look Dickie in the eye. She'd come out from under his wing. They were really sort of began to compete with each other. Who could work the longest hours, who could shake the most hands at events, etc. And they were both sent off to do a fundraising and propaganda tour of the States just before the outbreak, or just before America joined the war in 1941. So here they are on that tour. Mountbatten was beginning to move now among pretty exalted circles. Here he is at the Casablanca conference in January 1943 with Churchill and Roosevelt. And one of the things that people felt is he got on extremely well with everyone, really, other ranks, but also with Americans. He wasn't stuffy like a lot of naval officers. And I think, there was always this outsider element to Dickie. He wasn't really a conventional British naval officer. Here he is with Montgomery, planning D-Day. The two had a bit of a fight over who should take the blame for Dieppe. They each blamed each other. And that's clearly a big part of Dickie's career. There's this famous raid on Dieppe, which was meant to be a practice run for D-Day. As a result of getting on so well with the Americans and his knowledge of amphibious raids, in the 1943, he was posted to become Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia. And he went out, and one of the people on his staff was this woman called Janie Lindsay. She was the granddaughter of the Duke of Abercorn, fluent in French and German. She'd been the lover of David Niven and J.F. Kennedy. She was clearly a pretty alpha character. And they fell in love, and there's some wonderful love letters that I was shown between them. And this affair went on until the end of the war, when she, in fact, got divorced from her husband and married Beaverbrook's son instead of Mountbatten. I think they realized that they wouldn't be able to marry each other. Meanwhile, Edwina was having her own affair with this man called Bill Paley, who was the founder of CBS, the television company. God, sorry, didn't expect that. One of the things that they did when they went out to Southeast Asia, you may remember that the 14th Army was often known as the Forgotten Army. And when Mountbatten lectured them, he said, "You think you're the Forgotten Army. You're not the Forgotten Army. No one knows who you are, but they will, and I will make sure that people do." And he basically brought in a campaign of 3 M's. One was to raise morale, which he did in all sorts of ways to make their life more comfortable. The second was he dealt with malaria, which had meant that most of the people out there fighting actually weren't fighting, they were sick. So he brought nurses and medicines and all sorts of things. And the third thing was the monsoons. At that point, the Allies were not fighting through the monsoon season, which limited what they could do, and he decided that they would fight through the monsoon season. He gave Slim and other generals their head. He allowed them to get on with things. He made sure they had the resources they needed. And he did actually turn around the situation in Burma. Edwina came out too. She was helping again with this morale boosting and fundraising and lecturing the troops, still heavily involved with St. John Ambulance. When the war came, they continued to do their humanitarian work, and I think this is in some ways their finest hour. Prisoners of war had to be repatriated from a lot of these Japanese camps deep in the jungle. There had to be Japanese soldiers clearly sent back to Japan. There was a power vacuum in Southeast Asia, which was being filled by various nationalist movements. And I think Dickey, ahead of a lot of other people, realized that they couldn't go back to as things were. The days of the empire were over. And so I think he showed himself to be very progressive and forward-thinking. And I think it was for that reason that in the end of 1946, Clement Attlee appointed him as Viceroy of India. Perfect job for him. Well connected with the royal family, which the princes would like. Clearly very strong leadership credentials. And they needed someone young and dynamic to break the deadlock there, because Wavell really wasn't getting anywhere. The Labour government had made huge promises that the British now would give up India, and his job was to go out in March 1947 and to effect the transfer of power by June 1948. When he arrived there, he realized the situation was far worse than he had realized. There was communal rioting going on. The sectarian problems were much more acute than I think even anyone had realized. British authority was diminishing fast, and he decided to bring forward the transfer to August 1947, a decision that he's been heavily criticized for, but I personally feel was probably the only thing he could do, that if he hadn't gone then, there would have been nothing to give away. The decision really was that we should do this with as much dignity as possible, and so the sooner we did it, the better. The couple had actually been due to divorce just before they went out, but Edwina stuck with him. She realized that he would need her there, and they were a great team. She again continued her humanitarian work, particularly for women in India. And this is a famous scene in the northwest frontier in April 1947, when they stood down 70,000 Pathan tribesmen who had come basically looking for trouble, and they basically pacified them through force of personality. When they went there, Mountbatten realized that there were several people that he needed to bring on side. He needed to bring on side Nehru here in the center, who commanded the Hindus. He had to somehow reconcile Jinnah, who were responsible for the Muslims and what their claims were. And of course, he wanted his own country, Pakistan. And they also had to bring on side Gandhi, which they did very quickly. This was supposedly a spontaneous picture taken by a photographer as they walked in one day, but it showed to the Indians that basically Gandhi thought he could do business with them. There's some debate about the relationship with Nehru. I think Nehru very cynically realized that he could charm the Mountbattens and bring them on side. The result was the Mountbattens were not impartial as they should have been. I think the Pakistan is absolutely right to say that it wasn't a level playing field in terms of what was going on. Here you can see Nero's already got his feet out under the table there. There's Pamela, their younger daughter, who came out with them, who's still alive, aged 19. And I think it's certainly true that they showed him a great deal of favoritism. And that created, of course, a great deal of resentment among the Muslims, who also were very suspicious of the relationship between Edwina and Nero. Now, the conventional story is that relationship only began after independence in May 1948. My own instinct is it could well have begun beforehand. One of the problems that we forget about is when we look at these big events happening is the personal element. And it was a very hot summer. Everyone was working long hours, was very tired, and poor old Mountbatten also had to deal with Edwina, who was difficult at the best of times, but was now going through the menopause, who required long evenings of being comforted and lots of pan throwing. So there were all these extra tensions on the poor man that we kind of forget about. She had got over Bunny, and she was now having an affair with this man, Malcolm Sargent, the composer. So here he is out staying with them in India, with a friend of theirs, Biddy Monkton. But she also managed to find time to basically get this affair with Nehru going. So what happened? Yeah, she was an extraordinary woman. So we had independence, of course, in August 1947. Huge violence then, because what happened was the boundaries were not announced until after independence, the day after. And there was this huge transfer of populations as Hindus and Muslims changed and tried to get into each other's different countries. There were soldiers and police there, but to deal with it. But basically, the Indian politicians didn't do as much as they could have done. Of course, British authority now had finished, so we said, "Well, nothing to do with us, mate." There were soldiers there that could have been brought in by the Indian politicians, but they chose not to use them. So people blame Mountbatten for a lot of this. I think the problem lies with the Indian politicians who chose to let this violence take place. But also, the scale of it surprised everyone. There were huge columns of 700-800 groups who were storming these trains and killing people. So this is, in a sense, the relationship with Nehru and Edwina. They continued to see each other. He would come to Britain once a year. She would go to India for a few months at the beginning of each year. And it became a very sort of cozy relationship. Going back to the royal family, one of the things I discovered writing the book was that Mountbatten and King George VI basically colluded to encourage the courtship of the Queen and Prince Philip, going right back to Prince Philip being brought in as an escort for her in September 1939 when they went to visit Dartmouth, but actually encouraged all the time behind the scenes. And there was a big plan to make sure, for example, he joined the Royal Navy, so he would look good, then get naturalised, and he took Mountbatten's name. So the House of Mountbatten, in some ways, goes right back to Dickey. So here he is at the wedding, at the stag party in 1947. And what also surprised me is that when the Queen and Prince Philip were in Malta just after the war, when he was a young naval officer, Mountbatten saw a lot of them. In fact, they gave up their house so they could live there. But also, when the Queen and Prince Philip went on royal tours, they would leave Charles and Anne with them. And this is a picture of them just relaxing one day. And here they are on the steps of Broadlands. Edwina continued her humanitarian work, travelling the world. Really, basically killed herself through her overwork. Because suddenly, in February 1960, she went to bed one night, and when her secretary came to wake her up the next day, she found she had died of coronary thrombosis overnight. Around her were the various letters from Nehru that she'd been looking at. And this is the last picture taken of Edwina a few days before she died. Dickey was absolutely devastated. They'd actually grown quite close to each other. I think, like all good marriages, they spent very little time together, which always helps. But he was absolutely devastated by this. He continued to carry on. He'd been First Sea Lord, and he went on to be Chief of the Defence Staff. But he stopped taking on particular positions. He was offered a job in Rhodesia because he didn't have the support of Edwina around him. So they had been very much a team. This is Yola. She continued to be part of the furniture at Broadlands. And then he had a new girlfriend called Sibylla Tomaselli, who was a rich socialite in the Bahamas, who he spent a lot of time with, who's still alive. And then he also, this is the one woman everyone thought that he might marry. If you recognize her, she is called Sasha Abercorn. She's just died. She was 46 years younger than him, his goddaughter, the daughter of Gina and Bunny Phillips. So this was the new girlfriend. And then this woman here, which was a surprise to me, Shirley Maclaine, the actress. He used to go out to Hollywood a lot with the Variety Club, and they met in the mid-60s, and she would often, according to staff at Broadlands who are still alive, she would act as his official hostess. They said she was extremely nice, very clever woman, and no one had a harsh word to say about her. So here he is in Hollywood with Jane Mansfield and Clark Gable. Here he is with Princess Grace, who he was rather keen on. And here I've just put this picture in because you don't get many pictures of the royal family topless. So we're now into the 70s. He's spending a lot of time, he's now retired, he's spending a lot of time at the family home, Classybourne in Sligo. Very, very good grandfather. Here he is with his son-in-law David Hicks. Here he is. His one daughter, Patricia, had 7 children, the other, Pamela, had 3. So there were a lot of children around. He knew the IRA were after him, that the house was 12 miles south of the border, and he was, at times, had sometimes 20 policemen guarding the home. And there were various plots against him throughout this period, throughout the 60s and 70s. But he ignored it. He was always very, very keen to go. And in the summer of 1979, he was told that he shouldn't go. We just had, of course, the assassination of Ari Neve. There was a lot of tension there, but he decided to go. One of the interesting stories to emerge was from this man, Graham Yule, who's still alive. He was a young military policeman who was his bodyguard, and he did a risk assessment in the summer of 1979 saying, the vulnerable point here is actually the boat, Shadow 5. It's moored in the harbour, it's unprotected at night, anyone could stick a bomb on it, and we know that they've tried to do that in the past. So he also said, I've seen some Belfast number plates in Mullaghmore, which is the local town, which we know belong to members of the IRA. So what do you think would happen in those circumstances? Well, Graham Yule was sacked. He was made to sign a gagging order, which only expired in 2017. The protection was given to the Garda, very, very inexperienced officers, and we know that the Dundalk, the station nearby, was heavily penetrated by the IRA. So I think poor old Mountbatten was dealt a pretty rough hand there. We all know the story. Bank holiday Monday, 40 years ago almost exactly, the family went out to lift a lobster pot, and an 8-man team who'd been reconnoitring the area had set off a remote bomb and blew up Shadow 5. Mountbatten was killed instantly together with one of his grandsons and a local boy who was also on the boat. So I'm just going back, because I've got my slides slightly in order. So here they are. This is part of the rescue operation. This is his body being brought ashore. And this is the funeral service. Mountbatten's big regret was that he wasn't going to be present at his own funeral service. He had been planning it since 1967. Whenever anyone said, you can't do that, he would go and say to the Queen, can I have this? So he got everything he wanted. And there are long, long discussions about the involvement of the Royal Marines and the French and all sorts of things. But 50,000 people lined the route. It was, of course, watched around the world. This is some of the pictures from Classybourne. And it was a huge, huge event. Just after the service, there were 2 men who had been picked up acting suspiciously. In fact, they were picked up before the bomb was detonated. One was this man called Thomas McMahon, who was a well-known IRA bomb maker, being trained in Syria. Another was this man called Francis McGill, who again had a long association with the IRA. The only reason they were stopped was they were looking suspicious, and one of them then gave a false name. He didn't realize that was a name on the IRA wanted list. So otherwise they would have got off. Thomas McMahon was sent to prison for 19 years. He was let out under the Good Friday Agreement. Francis McGill, they didn't have enough forensic evidence to convict him, but he mysteriously died in a tractor accident while the SAS were on manoeuvres in the area shortly afterwards. And this is Prince Charles. Sorry, these got slightly out of order. This is Prince Charles at the service, paying tribute to what he called his honorary grandpa. Very, very close relationship. Philip hadn't taken as close an interest in his son as perhaps he might have done, and Mountbatten filled that role. And I think everyone was shattered by the whole experience. The crazy thing about the killing of Mountbatten was it didn't really win the IRA any support. It actually lost them a lot of support, particularly in North America. It meant that there was much closer cooperation between the North and the South afterwards. And one of the ironies is that Mountbatten had actually been in favour of United Ireland. He had actually offered himself as an intermediary to the IRA to see if he could, in a sense, with his progressive views, try and bring the two sides together. Now, that may be the point, really, to stop the talk. Mountbatten is this world-famous leader. He's died. People are deciding what to do with him. We're talking today about the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square being reserved for Prince Philip, although at that time they thought it might be Mountbatten. They were going to name a bank holiday after him. They had all sorts of professorships and things that were going to be lined up for him, lined up in his memory. But rumours began to circulate after he died. There were stories that perhaps he hadn't been all he seemed, that his life perhaps had been a bit of a lie. And the main story was that not only that he had basically curated his life and his legend, that it wasn't all that he'd cut it out to be, and I show that a little bit in the book. I think as Robert Armstrong, well known for being economical with the truth, said, his memory isn't accurate, but Lord Mountbatten thinks it's accurate. I think was the way they described it. He believes it's true. But the stories began to emerge. And one of my discoveries in the research was, under a Freedom of Information Act request, I got his FBI file, which had been opened in 1944. And in this is a document in the file. A woman called Lady Desise, a society hostess and gossip columnist, being interviewed by the FBI on something else, had mentioned that Mountbatten was a man of, was a homosexual with an interest in young boys. And I thought, well, okay, people say all sorts of things to the FBI, doesn't mean it's true. But I then found the files had been kept open, a whole series of files, right through to the 1950s, particularly as he rose from being First Sea Lord and other posts. And other people said the same thing. So a man called John Grombrack, who was an intelligence officer who reported into the FBI, ran his own group, a special thing called The Pond. He had stories. A woman, Lady Lestall, whose husband had been Secretary of State for India, had stories. So there seemed to be something to this. What was even more extraordinary was I began to find that after I began to ask for these files, the FBI told me that they'd been destroyed after I'd asked for them. So I then began to talk to people and found there are about 20 sources in a book, in a chapter I call Rumours, where I just lay out the evidence for people to draw their own conclusions about his bisexuality. But they come from people like Major Generals in the Guards, who talk about flats being set up for young officers. I even interviewed his last lover of the last 7 years, a young photographer. So I think we have a slightly different picture after this book, 40 years on, of Mountbatten. He said that he wanted the all biography should be warts and all. Whether he would have agreed with that now, I'm not sure. But the thing that I think gave it a new dimension was finding this man, a picture of, some letters from this man. His name is Frederick Lawrence Long. He was a tutor to Mountbatten in 1914 when Mountbatten was ill. He actually married Mountbatten. And some of the letters I found, I would suggest, make slightly strange reading. They were all sent in double envelopes, which was a trick that Mountbatten and Louie used later in life when they wanted to hide things. It's quite clear that most of the letters are missing. It's only because someone like me would look in miscellaneous 1916 when no one else could be bothered to do so. But here it is. As you know, there was only one Dick in the world for me, and there never will be anyone before or anybody near him in my affections. It is hardly necessary for me to add that I would give anything to wipe the floor with you. God bless you for the time of happiness we have had together. So I think there's certainly room for some more research there to find out exactly what the relationship was with Frederick Lawrence Long, who was a minister a vicar in Ipswich and died in 1960. But I think despite this, I think what I hope I've shown in the book, there's a much more human side to Mountbatten, both Mountbattens, that they, for all their extraordinary success as public figures, there was a great deal of insecurity and vulnerability in their story. But it is a wonderful story which takes you from the sort of socialite world of the south of France to Burma, to India, to high society in Britain. His life, both their lives, were highly dramatic and highly colourful. So I think you certainly can't say that they were boring. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I think there are some books to buy at the end if you like. Yes, question at the back.
In many ways. As for Edwina, she was one of the few socialists who I have ever admired personally. When in Kenya we were operating against the Mau Mau, I met them when I was flying home from completing my national service, and she asked me very pertinent questions about the conduct of the campaign. She killed herself in the died in the service of the Commonwealth, and she was a very admirable person. When I spoke to Dickie Mountbatten, who I met on 3 or 4 occasions some years later, I said, "Is it true that my father taught you the Morse code?" And he said, "Absolutely." They were contemporaries in the Royal Navy. Mountbatten, in fact, went much further than my father. But they were a very lovable couple, and there was a great deal to admire in both of them.
No, I would second all that. And I think you'll find when you read the book, it's a very broadly sympathetic account of both of them. And I think I absolutely share your views. There's a lot there's a bit in the book about how she got into a fight with the cabinet ministers on this issue of Mau Mau. But she was prepared to stand up for what she believed. And I think she was a great progressive herself. But the book, I think, as I say, when you read it, you will find most people who've read it have said to me, I didn't like them before I read the book, and I liked them a lot more when I finished it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hello? Yeah, congratulations. Splendid talk. When I was 16, I joined the Navy with Anthony Simmons Gooding, who was the late husband of Margie here, and we went to Dartmouth, trained down from Paddington, arrived quite late at night, and they gave us some soup, and then they sat us down and they showed us In Which We Serve, which is the Noel Coward, based on, apparently pretty loosely based on, from what you're saying, Mountbatten and the Kelly. And we learned from that how to be a naval officer. So from then on, we were all Noel Coward. We wanted silk dressing gowns and cigarette holders and all the rest of it. 4 years later, we finished at Dartmouth, and at our passing out parade, we are inspected by Mountbatten. So he walks past us all. And I have to say, he didn't lay a finger on me.
Yes, the lady at the back. Have I had permission? I interviewed Lady Pamela Hicks and 2 of her children, and they were absolutely charming. She was the one who told me the story of Bunny Phillips also having an affair with Janie Lindsay at the same time as her father. But no, it's not authorised. I deliberately didn't want it to be authorised. All the books on Mountbattens in the past have been authorised, and as a result, I don't think they're entirely accurate. And it's quite clear, I mean, there are even some bits, I've seen the papers showing how he sent back and got the writers to rechange chapters because he didn't like what they'd written. So this, I would argue, is the first properly independent biography.
This is a little perhaps outside your book, but I wonder if you would be prepared to comment on the relationship between Prince Charles and Mountbatten, and in particular, whether Mountbatten was involved in any way in encouraging Prince Charles to marry Diana.
Well, Mountbatten was dead, really, before he could get to any position. But I think that the feeling is that he wouldn't have encouraged it, or he would have found a way out. He was a great royal fixer. I mean, I talked to Princess Michael of Kent, and she explained how when Prince Michael wanted to marry her, he found a way of doing that by them going off to marry in a civil ceremony in Vienna. So he was very good at, I think he was very pragmatic and practical in the way he worked, and that's how he got things done. He was very close to Charles. He would send Charles fun birthday presents when his father would send him boring ones. There's a story at the Dartmouth graduation of Charles that no one from the family was going there, so Mountbatten got a helicopter and went. When he was at Portsmouth, he would live at Broadlands. He was able to bring his girlfriends there without having too much scrutiny. Mountbatten himself actually pushed his own granddaughter, Amanda, as one of Charles's girlfriends. So I think he was a very wise mentor to him, and they were very, very close. And I think he felt he had this role in the royal family. If you think about it, he'd seen public affairs right back at the beginning of the century. His life is the story of the 20th century. And people hugely respected him. They always joked that on the balcony at ceremonies that he had the sharpest elbows to make sure he got to the front. And that when anything, he needed anything done, or he was late for anything, he would say, "I've just been to see the Queen." And so he was treated with a little bit of, what's the word? Someone used the word as a sort of amusing uncle. But I think he was greatly respected. When the Duke of Windsor died and they needed to recover some royal jewellery and letters from the Duchess of Windsor, he was persuaded to bring it back. So I think he's a very important figure in the royal family, absolutely, right through. And he stayed, I think people blame him for jumping ship from the Duke of Windsor to Bertie, which he did to a certain extent, but he did keep in touch with the Duke of Windsor, and they still remained friends. Yeah.
There was when the Queen and Prince Philip married, and they weren't allowed to. The name Mountbatten was not used, and Windsor was replaced. So I think I have that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Mountbatten was thrilled that his nephew took the name Mountbatten, and he thought he'd created the House of Mountbatten when they got married, and he bragged about this at a dinner party. And when Queen Mary heard about it, she got terribly upset and talked to Churchill. And the Queen was put in quite a difficult position because she didn't want to upset anyone. The line was that they were the House of Windsor. And so they came up with a compromise. They're now the House of Mountbatten Windsor. And I think anyone who isn't a Royal Highness is now Mountbatten Windsor. So he sort of got there. But absolutely, yeah, they did want to call it Oldcastle, but they thought that sounded too much like a brewery. There were some questions at the back, or have they been answered? Nothing else?
Well, I think you're done, Andrew.
Thank
you very much.
I'm done. Well, I'm very happy.
Thank you very much.
I'll be around if anyone wants to ask any more questions.
Thanks for a fantastic, fascinating talk. You certainly didn't miss out on the scandal, and I hope you sell a lot of books afterwards. And when you write your next book, please come back and see us.